Okay, I think, Johnny, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, yay. Okay. We had just a little bit of technical difficulty, but I think we are good to go now. So we're going to get started with our webinar today. I am Stella Beard with Kentucky Spin. And before we bring Johnny on and we show our faces and all of that, I want to tell you just a little bit about Kentucky Spin, what we are and what we do. We are Kentucky Spin actually is the Kentucky Special Parent Involvement Network. We are the Parent Training and Information Center for the state of Kentucky. There is one in every state. Some states have two. Kentucky has one, and that is Kentucky Spin. And we are actually funded by the U.S. Department of Education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we have been the Parent Training and Information Center for the state of Kentucky since 1988, when we first received the PTI grant. And what we do is we provide training, information, and support for children and youth and professionals with all types of disabilities, birth through age 26, their parents, families, and professionals. So something we do not do is I like to share this because we do not act as attorneys. We do, however, empower families to effectively advocate for their children, and we provide peer support to help families access needed information and resources. And one of the wonderful things about our staff and our consultants is we are all parents who have a child or an adult child with an intellectual developmental disability, a disability of all types, or we have a disability ourselves, or we're a sibling of someone with a disability. I personally have a 24-year-old with a disability, so I've walked this for many, many years, and I love the fact that we can provide that support to families because we've actually been there and understand what throughout this journey. This next slide, we have shown since we went virtual in March, which seems like an eternity ago, but we immediately in March, when the pandemic COVID-19 hit, we transferred everything to webinar based. And so every Tuesday and Thursday, we have been providing webinars for families and professionals on a variety of topics. And this slide simply says, together we can accomplish great things for our children. And none of us have all the answers, but we are all working through this pandemic and adjusting as we go. So I am very excited today to have my friend, I can truly say that, Johnny Collette, with us. And Johnny, if you want to show your webcam now, there's a little button that on that left-hand side that says, it looks like a camera, and it says no one can see me. Click to share. There you are. Yay, and here I am.
Imagine that. Imagine that.
Imagine that. It actually is working right now. So I am going to not show my screen right now. I'm going to get rid of my PowerPoint, and let me make sure that we are still good to go. That's not going to work. Hang on. Let me click one little thing. This is the first time I've actually done it this way. And so I am going to try to figure this out without messing up too much. Let me just go back here, and we're going to go from this slide right here. We're just going to keep us up there and show that slide because I'm not quite sure how to change that without messing everything up. So this is the way we're going to do it, if that's okay with you, Johnny.
That's fine with me.
All right, great, great. Well, we decided when I asked Johnny to be our speaker today, we wanted to have a conversation. We just kind of wanted to chit chat, and Johnny and I go way, way back. And so we like to talk anyway. Both of us are talkers. Can you agree with that?
Yeah.
So I wanted just to sit down and just talk with you a little bit about transition, what it means to you, and just I have some questions for you. And then of course we'll try to stay on track as much as we can, but knowing you and I, we will probably venture off on our own conversation, and that's wonderful. But we really just wanted just to kind of just talk about transition But first, before we get started, I want you just to tell us a little bit about yourself, some of your work experiences, so that folks here will kind of get an idea of where you've been, where you've come from, and then now your role right now at the Human Development Institute.
Yeah, happy to do it. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. I wish I could be, we could all be together somewhere and enjoy each other's company that way. But, we're really grateful for the opportunity, and I appreciate Kentucky Spin and Stella, for you reaching out about this. And yeah, I mean, it's exciting to think about this topic. And, I have a little bit of experience as I think back. It really transitions what I've always done. When I was a teacher, I was a high school teacher. So working with students transitioning out of high school and toward that was really what I did every day. So I was really thrilled to teach in Scott County here in Kentucky and had a number of years there in the classroom. And then I moved to the Kentucky Department of Education. I had a few different roles there. The first role I had there, again, was focused on transition. So we were thinking about how we were supporting districts and schools and IEP teams as we think about graduation from high school, as we think about back in those days reducing the dropout rate, thinking about really those measurable post-secondary goals that are so important, and then thinking about post-school outcomes. So that's what I got to do for a little while at the Kentucky Department of Education, and then I moved to an assistant division director role there in the Office of Special Education at KDE. And then soon after that, I moved into the division director role where I was, the state special education director. So I enjoyed every day of that and getting to interact with schools and districts and parents and families and students from that perspective. So I left KDE in early 2015, and I went to a national nonprofit in Washington, D.C., the Council of Chief State School Officers. So what CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers, does is really just works with all of the state agency heads across the country and their staff. So in Kentucky, we call that a commissioner. In other states, they may call it a secretary. They may call it something else. But that was a great opportunity to work at a nonprofit. I hadn't done that before. And so my role at CCSSO was really to work with state agency heads and their teams around improving special ed programs in their states. I was there a few years, and then I went to the U.S. Department of Education, where I was the Assistant U.S. Education Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. And that office at the U.S. Department of Ed really has two big components. The Office of Special Education Programs, which really administers all the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA work. So that was one component. The other component was really the Rehabilitative Services Administration that administers a portion of the VOC Rehab program as well. So great opportunity to really serve in that role and to serve our country, but to also think about policy really across the life of an individual, right? The one thing I said about working there was I felt like it was a unique opportunity because we got to impact positively, hopefully, on the lives of individuals really from birth through adulthood as we think about education and employment. So was glad to come back home to Kentucky in October of 2019 and to be able to join the staff here at the Human Development Institute at UK in November of 2019, so a little over a year. And I am the deputy director there. Our executive director is Kathy Shepard-Jones, and many of you know her. So just thrilled to be a part of the team here.
That's awesome. I really wanted everyone to be sure that they heard, where you've been and the journey that you've been through, and how fortunate I believe Kentucky is to have you back. Even though I loved it when you were there, and I followed everything you were doing when you were there in Washington, but I'm really glad that you're back here because you have such a wealth of knowledge, and so I think that we're very excited that you're here. And even though I know it's been a year, but to me, I'm like, he's back, so I really am glad that you're here. So I want to talk with you just a little bit about transition. Of course, that's why we wanted you on our call today, because I believe that you have a wealth of knowledge there. And so let's just talk about it for a few minutes. So tell everybody on the call, when does transition occur, and what does that mean for students and parents? What does it look like for students and parents?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think, one of the things I say when I'm asked a question like that is something that everybody on the phone, and certainly parents and families know better than anyone, really. Transition's a big topic, right? So what we
Oh,
know
yeah.
is children with disabilities are experiencing many transitions throughout their educational career and even through their day, right? So transitions happening all the time
All the
in
time.
ways. But I think primarily, if I understand really, the focus may be on sort of that secondary transition today. So I'll talk a little bit about that. When a student's in 8th grade or 14 years old and older, that's when schools, as you all know very well, that's when schools are really thinking about that multi-year course of study and developing that multi-year course of study that's aligned with a student in Kentucky, a student's individual learning plan. And that's really important, right? I'll come back to this notion of alignment later, probably, because it's just sort of naturally where I go. But that multi-year course of study, of course, is developed at that time or begun at that time to really help students reach what are becoming their post-secondary goals. So then at 16, it really ramps up, right? At 16 or earlier, if it's appropriate for the student, that's when we really start digging deep in terms of services that are needed for effective and positive transition after high school. That's when we start writing these measurable post-secondary goals. And as I'm confident most people on the call know, there are required areas where you have to write measurable post-secondary goals. One of those is in post-secondary education or training. So that's required. Every student with an IEP, 16 years old until they're gone, we're writing measurable post-secondary goals in the area of education and training, also in employment. So both of those are required. Every IEP at that point is going to have a measurable post-secondary goal in education, training, and also in employment. And for some students, they may also have a goal if it's applicable to them for independent living. But that at 16, that's really when we start kind of digging deep and thinking about not just what this student may want to do, what they may be interested in. All of that matters, right? In terms of transition assessments that we've done, other data that we're looking at as the team. But at 16, we're saying, okay, we're getting closer and closer to that. Let's start thinking about real concrete strategies. Let's start holding ourselves really accountable to these post-secondary outcome goals that we're writing. So that's when it gets really, really kind of in the weeds in a good way. A couple other things I may say about that, Stella, but I'll pause and see if there's any follow-up.
No, I think that's exactly what a lot of times I think families, we have a certain thing that we have in mind of what we think transition should look like when our child exits high school. But yet a lot of times I don't think, families realize too that the school has, things that they have to have that are requirements too. And so getting the two to mesh together sometimes can be a little complicated. And so that's one of the things that I think you're sharing really well, is that there are requirements, but then we also have to line those up with what the student really wants out of that transition goal, and how it is going to be something that can be actually really tangible and something that they can really do in their future.
Yeah, and this is where if it's okay, and if it's not, you all have the power to kick me off the webinar here and never invite me back. But it may be a function of my age, it may be a function of the different perspectives I've seen the work, but I'm tending to be a little less filtered on some things, so you'll probably hear what could be characterized, I guess, as a bit of editorializing, but I hope not in a negative sense. What you lean in there to, Stella, is something I think is really important in this context, is that we are developing individualized plans. It turns out these are individuals.
That's right.
It turns out these are people. These are people who happen to have a disability. These are students who happen to have an IEP, and who happen to be receiving, supports to achieve their goals, et cetera. But, these are individualized plans that are intended. I think this is here's my editorial point for a minute, intended to enable the student to make progress, right? I'm going to come back to that again and again, probably, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these are individualized plans, one, but that these are plans that are intended to enable a child to make progress in light of that child's circumstances. So they're not just intended to enable a district to remain compliant.
I love that. Yes, perfect.
Let me make sure I'm not misunderstood by anyone. Compliance is absolutely critical. I mean, these things that we're required to do didn't just fall out of the air to keep somebody busy, right? In the wisdom of Congress and other in Department of Ed and implementing regulations, et cetera, and the state, the reason compliance matters is because we believe if we do these things and we do these things well, we increase the potential for students to be successful. So what I often say is compliance is not the enemy, it just cannot be the end, right? So instead of sort of seeing the achievement of compliance alone as success, which it's not, right? It's
right. It's more than a checkbox on a piece of paper.
Right. Compliance is essential, but by itself is not sufficient to improve outcomes, right? So when we're talking about these individualized plans, it is important to be compliant. That does matter, and it matters a lot because that increases the potential for students to be successful. But sort of where I try to get clear on this is these individualized plans are not just intended to enable a district to remain compliant, they're intended to enable a child to make progress. And I think both of those things are true, right? So what we often do, the big we, what we often do is we kind of gravitate toward one or the other of those. Well, if you gravitate toward one or the other, because I really don't care which one you gravitated to, you're going to be off track. You're just going to be off in a different direction, right? So both of those things are true. Now, one of the things I would highlight that I think many people are aware of, the U.S. Supreme Court issued what I called publicly, and others did, a landmark decision in 2017 in the Andrew versus Douglas County case. And that's y'all can look at that at your leisure. But the bottom line is what the court decided, and by the way, decided unanimously. When's the last time 9 people or 2 people got together and unanimously decided anything, right? But in 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously issued these findings, and I do want to read. I'm looking down at some notes. What the court found was that to meet its obligation under IDEA, a school must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. And the court also said that every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. Now, I'll probably come back to that a bit later, but what I want to highlight there is an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress is the standard, right? It's not the exception.
Right.
It's to be the standard, right? And schools and districts and parents and IEP teams and everybody's working really hard all the time around this and working collaboratively and effectively in many cases around this. But having this opportunity today, and again, I hope it's not seen as editorializing. I mean, from my perspective, I don't think it is. I think we need to talk more about that being the standard of what an IEP is intended to be.
I like that. That's excellent. That's excellent. And I think that's something I know as a parent that I always struggled with my son is, are the goals, are they to the best of his ability? Am I challenging him enough? Or is the school challenging him enough? Or are we allowing the disability especially the history of a certain disability or disability category or eligibility category driving what is being what the goal is. And I hope that makes sense what I'm trying to say. It should not, the disability should not define the outcome of what the student or child is, can accomplish. And I think a lot of times eligibility drives it versus what the high expectation level should be. So that's always something that I struggled with my son. And sometimes I'll let the bar drop way too low instead of pushing it a little bit higher. And so I think parents, face that a lot. I'm not really sure what to do and how far we can go. Kind of along those lines, in Kentucky, we have 2 diploma options for students to exit. We've got the regular diploma that, typical students or even students with disabilities graduate with. And then we also have what's called an alternate diploma. And it is something that I still believe is confusing for families to understand that, what that actually means. And, Johnny, I was fortunate enough to be with you on the state advisory panel for many, many years and be a part of that. And I was on the state advisory panel with you when this actually was passed and became, and although the intentions I believe were great, and I believe it was something that needed to occur. What families don't realize, though, and maybe you can explain this better than what my language would be, is that it is considered an alternate diploma, but standards didn't really change as far as the diploma options go. Can you kind of explain that a little bit about what it means for those, for students who are on the regular track diploma versus an alternate diploma?
I can probably say a little bit about that. I will defer to KDE as the experts on that, and certainly, you have many opportunities and have to talk with KDE who can talk about this better than I can. I agree with you. That was I do believe this was a significant step forward in our state prior to the Kentucky alternate diploma. Affected what we had is a certificate of attainment, or and which in some cases really didn't tell students and families much about what had happened, probably didn't tell, employers or other, education settings, post-secondary, very much of what had occurred during that period of time. The student was in high school. So I do think to the department's credit, to the legislature's credit, state board's credit, this was a significant step forward. And
absolutely,
during those days, in terms of standards, a lot of work was done by the Department of Ed, by low incidence consultants at co-ops, by other people and stakeholders who engaged in conversations around, okay, let's make sure that we are aligning the alternate diploma standards to the Kentucky core academic standards. So that work did occur, and that is significant, right? So there are some people who said, well, maybe all it did was change the name. I think I would push back on that a little bit. I don't think that's all that happened. I think a lot of incredible work by folks across the state occurred to make sure that maybe it's not what we want it to be ultimately, but it's a significant step forward, not only in how we're referring to this, but also making sure that we're communicating for students who are participating in this. They don't have some separate standards over there. We're going to be looking at Kentucky core academic standards. We're going to be prioritizing those. We're going to be aligning this diploma to those standards. So that's really important. Now, again, it's an alternate diploma, which means that's what it is, but it also defines what it's not. It's not a regular diploma.
Right.
It's not a high school diploma.
Exactly. And some of the great work I know that's been focused around the alternate diploma, I know Jill Griffiths has done so much with that and has made some tremendous changes since my son exited. And that was really sad for me that he wasn't there when those changes really occurred. But it is so exciting to see what the expectation level is now with that. And so I am very pleased with what Kentucky has done with that. And I agree, it is more than a name change. And we have seen some great things, that have come along with that.
Well, and I will say at HDI, we're happy, we got a number of projects, as you know, Stella, that we engage in across the state, and happy to support the Kentucky Department of Education in this area as we think about K-Prep assessment for students in the alternate assessment. So we do a lot of work with KDE supporting, administration of those windows of assessment that many of your members will know about.
That's great. And going along those lines, I know that there is, there are some options for students who do exit with an alternate diploma, and, allows them to attend college with that. And, what kind of tell us a little bit about that, what it looks like? I mean, do they get to use KEYS money? Like typical students? What about student loans and, even grants? So can you tell us a little bit about what, we hear, of course, another acronym, a CTP.
Yeah.
We're in special ed, my goodness, can we have any more acronyms?
We can, just hang on.
But that comprehensive and post-secondary program. Tell everybody a little bit about that and who can attend those programs.
Yeah, so let's talk about it sort of broadly for a minute. So inclusive higher education programs, certainly there are schools across the state who have had over the years different programs that focused on students with particular disability, for maybe autism. Maybe they had a program, an inclusive higher ed program focused on students with intellectual disabilities, other things that folks may be aware of that have occurred over the years across the state in terms of inclusive higher ed programs. So that's kind of broad. So now let's go down really funnel to the specific point on comprehensive transition post-secondary programs, or CTPs. So again, comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs. You go all the way back to 2008 at the federal level when the Higher Education Act was reauthorized. So as we're thinking about higher education for students across the country, in 2008, we said at the federal level, in the wisdom of Congress, they said, let's make sure we're talking about all kids. And so there was some things that occurred in the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act that increase options and opportunities for students with intellectual disabilities in higher education. So what it did is it effectively established the opportunity for these programs, comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs, or CTPs. Now, these are programs that a college or university has to apply to become, right? So we currently have 3 active CTPs who are approved CTPs in the state. We have an approved program at Murray State University. We have an approved program at Northern Kentucky University. We have an approved program at Bluegrass Community Technical College. We are also, I'm happy to tell you, in the final stages of finalizing an application to establish a CTP at the University of Kentucky. So more to come on that in the future, but we're incredibly, incredibly excited about that. So HDI has really served as a statewide technical assistance center for these other schools for 10 plus years, really, since 2008 and 2010. Regulations kind of started rolling out from the Higher Ed Act. So what about these programs, right? These programs are intentionally designed to support students with intellectual and developmental disabilities in higher education. So there are a number of hallmarks to these programs that we often point out, and I'll do it very briefly. And one is academic and social integration with their non-disabled peers, right? So what these programs are not, or should not be, are these things that sit over in that building, in that room, on that campus somewhere for these kids, right? That's not the point here.
Right.
The point is that students with intellectual disabilities are engaged in a meaningful college experience that leads to a meaningful credential. Now, every school is going to define that differently, what that means, what those areas of focus are. But it is about academic and social integration with their non-disabled peers. So I think that's really important. And very much like what happens in K-12, right, where we have an IEP or we have a 504 or something, very similar to that. in these programs, there's an individualized person-centered planning process that really drives this program and outlines, okay, what does it mean to have a meaningful college experience, and what courses, what experiences, academic and otherwise, is this student having that ultimately leads to a meaningful credential that is meaningful to them, that is meaningful to an employer, that is meaningful to a university, right? So that person-centered planning part of this is obviously a critical part. And you mentioned financial aid. So students with intellectual disabilities who are enrolled in approved CTPs. Now, I want to be very clear. That doesn't mean you just go to any university wherever and this everything I'm saying is true, right? I'm talking about those programs like Northern, Murray, BCTC, UK, and others. There will be others, I think, in the few years to come. These programs that have applied to establish a CTP. So if a student with intellectual disability is enrolled in an approved CTP program, then they are eligible for federal and state financial assistance. So if, you know, just like any other student, if they complete a FAFSA and demonstrate financial need, then, you know, these students will be eligible for example, Pell Grants, for example, federal work study. In Kentucky, we're very grateful. The wisdom of the legislature, I think, was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, and we were glad, along with Kentucky Spin and others back then, who were thinking about, well, what does this mean for students in KEYS money, right? So as many of you know, KEYS money is tied to grade point average, right? So if I've got a student who's participating in alternate assessment, maybe that student's not taking classes where they're achieving credits, maybe they're not leaving high school with a GPA. What about them? If they go to one of these programs, if KEYS is tied specifically to GPA? Well, again, there was enabling legislation here in Kentucky the last time in 2016 that said if you're in an approved CTP program, you get your KEYS money. You get your KEYS money. So if you're enrolled in 6 or more hours during an academic term, that's $500 KEYS money. If you're enrolled in less than 6 hours during an academic term, that's $250 KEYS money. So we are very well situated in Kentucky and to have addressed this issue. And so I want you to think about that for a minute. 2008 at the federal level, right? Sometimes we aren't always used to the federal level removing barriers, but at the federal level, the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act in 2018 really removed a lot of barriers for students with intellectual disabilities in higher ed. And we've removed barriers in Kentucky through legislative action and otherwise to make sure that students had access to not only federal, but also state funding through KEYS. So anyway, I mean, the point, bottom line is it's meaningful. It leads to something meaningful. It prepares students for competitive integrated employment and independent living. And it really, you know, we're all very grateful for the programs we have in our state. Again, I'm very optimistic that we're going to have more programs start in Kentucky over the years to come, and HDI is in a position to support, provide technical assistance and support to those. But this is about increasing access, options, and opportunities for students with disabilities in higher ed. And we know that it's important to harness the power. We know that we can harness the power of higher education to improve employment outcomes for students as well.
I think that's great. I think a lot of times we forget how far, you know, Kentucky sometimes is known as not being that progressive, but really everything you just said right there shows that we are ahead of the game on so many things. And we, you know, people need to realize that and see that, and because it is a positive thing. I'm going to ask Michaela from our office is also on the call with us, and she's kind of monitoring questions for us, Johnny. So I'm going to see just real quick if anyone has a question. Michaela, can you tell us if anyone has a question out there?
Yes, so we do have a few questions. The first one says, in regards to KEYS money, a student who enrolls in an approved comprehensive program post-graduation can receive KEYS money without having earned credits in high school. Is that correct?
That is correct. If you take a look at the legislation, state legislation 2016, I'm happy to send that to you. The point is, this is a student with a documented intellectual disability who is enrolled in an approved CTP program. Yes, they get their KEYS money.
Another question that we have is, where can I find a list of approved CTPs?
I think that Stella probably has or will have shared with you a brief that we recently did. They're on there, and the programs are hyperlinked on that, I think. But so that's the quickest place. But also, again, it's Murray State University, Northern Kentucky University, and Bluegrass Community and Technical College.
I will put that in our follow-up email, that link, because I believe it's on Kentucky Works page.
That's
and
right.
I can shoot that along with the follow-up email everybody on the call will be getting today. So we'll be sure and make sure that they get that.
Okay.
Are there any more questions right now, Michaela?
So what are some examples of concrete strategies that you have found to be most beneficial when creating a transition plan?
So like in K-12, is that what we're talking about, like an IEP?
I'm assuming so.
Yeah, I mean, this may not sound like a concrete strategy, but I'm going to argue that it is, because without it, you know, you're probably never going to crack the nut, right? If we can say it that way. You know, I can't emphasize enough the incredible power of parent voice in these plans that are being developed for your children, or if you're a provider, those students that you serve. So that's why, again, in the wisdom of Congress, when IDEA was written all those years ago and reauthorized several times, the makeup of that IEP team was intentional, right? And the parent membership on an IEP team, I can't emphasize enough. And that's partly why I went back to and really emphasize that notion of an IEP that's reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress. I mean, what I would argue there is, again, that your voice is critical in that, in discussing whether or not this IEP kind of meets that standard or not, and asking those kinds of questions. The other thing I would say, again, some people may not think it's concrete, but I think I can pretty much guarantee you, based on some experience, that without it, it won't work. And that is meaningful and effective collaboration with everyone who has a stake in that child's success, right? What I have found over the years is, and that also includes like agency coordination, right? Some students are potentially eligible, for example, for VR, and maybe they're receiving pre-employment transition services while they're in high school. Maybe they've applied for voc rehab services and been determined eligible, and they're receiving other services, maybe in high school and then beyond. Well, as we think about there's all sorts of plans being written for kids. You got an IEP that's being written for kids. If you're eligible for VR, you've got an individual plan for employment. There are probably at least one or two other plans, depending on other agencies that you're interacting with. So all these plans are being written for this person. Now, my question is, to what extent are the actors who are developing those plans coordinating those plans, right? So if we're not, then we're all doing our best. We're all trying hard. We all are well intended. But I would argue that unless we are doing everything we can to coordinate those where we can, and sometimes we can't, but where we can, that's going to increase the potential for success. So I know that's more infrastructure system stuff, but I would argue that is as concrete and important as anything else, because if you get that system working, then you can drop strategies in that system, and they're going to have a lot more potential to be effective. If you don't have that working, you can drop any strategy you want in there, and you're probably going to struggle for it to be as effective as it could have been. And what I often say, kind of the editorialized part of this, is I have low tolerance for not many things, I hope. But I have low tolerance for at least two things. One, I have low tolerance for low expectations for kids, right? So I have low tolerance for that. I'm not going to have a conversation with people about whether or not we ought to have high expectations for students. I think high expectations are non-negotiable. Now, I do think they are individually realized, but I do think they're non-negotiable. So I have a low tolerance for low expectations for kids. The other thing I have a low tolerance for, and I'm just being honest with friends here, I have a low tolerance for adults who can't figure out how to work together on behalf of students, right? These are not students and parents, families, or problems to solve alone. These are our problems to solve on their behalf. And I think we've got to get that infrastructure right so that it becomes a much more hospitable environment to drop these other strategies and practices into. That was a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
But that was great advice. Thank you so much. I think that's a great answer.
Makes total sense, total sense. I'm going to warn you, my dogs all of a sudden now have decided to run all through my living room. It just baffles me at the timing of everything.
Well, they responded to the meeting request. They knew what time it was.
That's exactly right. So on kind of those same regards, let's talk a little bit about, we have about 15 minutes. So I want to be sure that we get to some of the things that we want to bring up. There is something that a lot of families don't know about called Youth 1 Year Out data. And of course, we call it yo-yo. And many years ago, I used to be one of those callers. And so my job was, after students graduated with disabilities, after they had exited high school for 1 year, my responsibility was to call them, find out what they're doing now. And so I was one of many callers who did that around our state. And then that data then is all put together for a beautiful report, and they call it the Youth 1 Year Out data. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Johnny, and really why that data is so important for when we're talking about achievement gaps and stuff like that, that we're going to kind of talk about a little bit in a minute?
Yeah, I know we're going to run close on time, so I'll be brief here so we can make sure to get to some other questions that I think you have. So the Kentucky Post-School Outcome Center is a project at the Human Development Institute. So, and we work with the Kentucky Department of Education to collect these data and to provide reports to the Kentucky Department of Education around, what's happening in students' lives, former students who had IEPs when they were in high school, but who have left high school. So as we look a year after that, what's going on? What's going on in terms of, again, those things we wrote goals for, right? We wrote goals for post-secondary education and training. We wrote goals for employment. We wrote goals in some cases for independent living. So those and other things, well, what's happening a year later then on that? And then to share that information and report to KDE. And KDE does a phenomenal job, I think, looking at those data and those reports and really using those data to inform practice. So grateful to the Department of Ed for the work that they continue to do to inform conversations around improvements that need to be made based on what we know is happening a year after students leave high school. So let me give you some real data points here that may be interesting to you, and I want to talk about it in the area of higher education, then I'll talk about it in the area of employment. So as we think about higher education, what those data show us, the most recent data, so what the data I'm going to give you is the hottest off the presses data, 2020 data based on students who left high school a year ago. Okay, so as we think about higher education, students with disabilities in general, so across disability categories, 18% of students with disabilities are enrolled in college or university a year after they left high school. 18%. So again, that is irrespective of any disability category. That's all kids with disabilities across disability categories. 18%. So I assume that number was higher, right? So the numbers get lower though when you dig a little deeper into specific categories of disability. For example, students with significant disabilities. Now, when I'm referring to that, I'm referring to students under the category of FMD, MMD, multiple disabilities, autism. So if we just kind of look at that chunk of data, only 10% are enrolled in college or university a year after high school. Now, if we go even deeper and just say, okay, let's just look at students with intellectual disabilities, that number is 6%. So 18% for all kids, 10% for students with significant disabilities, 6% for students with intellectual disabilities who enrolled in college or university a year after they leave high school. Now let's talk about employment and specifically competitive employment, okay? So again, think that framework again. Students with disabilities across disability categories, 40% are competitively employed a year after they leave high school. So what about students with significant disabilities? How does that compare to the 40% of all kids with disabilities? Students with significant disabilities, 24% are competitively employed in the year after they left high school. What about students with intellectual disabilities only? 11% are competitively employed in the year that they left high school. Those numbers alone probably raise some awareness at the least and concern, I hope. But there's another number I want to give you. So that's looking at higher education and competitive employment, like competitive integrated employment. When we look at any other employment type or any other post-secondary education type, what we find is that 52% of students with significant disabilities are not engaged in any other employment or in any post-secondary education in the year after they left high school. So that's kind of real quick on Kentucky Public School Outcome Center and the Youth 1 Year Out, and some data that probably is, you can look at that more. I mean, KYPSO, that's KYPSO.org. If you go to KYPSO.org, there is on the navigation bar, I forgot exactly what it's called, but it's something like data for public use or something like that. You can click on that and go wild on data.
And the data is alarming to me, you know, when I hear those numbers, especially when you talk about the other category that aren't doing anything. I mean, the other numbers are alarming too, but when you think about 52% of students with significant disabilities, so those are the students that more than likely have exited with an alternate diploma, a lot of those are not engaged and are not employed or not, attending any type of a post-secondary college, anything. They're just not doing much. That to me it's sad. And it is, it's heartbreaking to hear those numbers like that. And it's something that, I think as parents and as, people especially involved in advocacy, need to look at those numbers and begin to see. And I know there are so many wonderful things that are going on to help those gaps. And so as we talk about that, as we talk about some gaps there, we hear a lot about achievement gaps. We hear that a lot of times. We also hear, about there's not enough opportunities available for students when they're in high school. So, but what I want you to kind of talk about a little bit is, what should the expectations be? Talk a little bit about that as we kind of begin to wrap up here. And, what can we do as parents to set that bar higher, but also, have a realistic idea too about that. But can you just talk to us just a little bit about that, Johnny?
Yeah, I'd love to, and I'd love to leave you with a few thoughts that I hope will resonate. And what I often say about anything I say is, if it resonates with you, use it as much as you want. If it doesn't, forget it as fast as you can, right? So I'll leave you with a few things. I mean, in terms of what parents can do, it's in so many ways what parents are already doing, right? And but I want to sort of raise some urgency around that, if I might. What I would say is, remember that what I believe is true and what I know is true is that those who are closest to the student, including the student and parents and others, know their needs best, right? I hope you always feel that way. I hope that is always empowered in every situation you're in. But what we used to say when I was in DC is the best ideas don't come from inside the Beltway. They don't. The best ideas come from those who know the students best, and those are the ones who are closest to the students. And that doesn't mean everybody else involved doesn't have good ideas. They do, and they're important. That's why we're a team. And that's why it's not only you who has to improve outcomes for your child. That's why it's a team. But your voice is critical to the success of these plans that are being developed and implemented for your children. And I hope you always feel that way. And I'll do everything I can to make sure that that we continue to talk about the critical importance of parent voice. And I'm grateful so much for all that has happened in our state at the Department of Ed and other agencies who understand that and who rely on that and who respond appropriately and productively to the feedback from those closest to the students. Now, let me go a little further in sort of that, again, hopefully not editorializing too much kind of way, but as a parent, I would encourage you, don't just be content that a compliant IEP has been written, right? Now, I want to circle back. Please don't misunderstand me. A compliant IEP is essential. Again, compliance is not the enemy. It just shouldn't be the end. The reason we do these things and are held accountable for these things is because if we do them well, it increases the potential for students to be successful. But don't be content, just content that a compliant IEP has been written. I would encourage you to discuss in those meetings, discuss whether the IEP is reasonably calculated, is reasonably, will reasonably enable your child to make progress in light of their circumstances. I don't know how many times that question gets on the table in ARC meetings. I would suggest it should always be on the table, right? So we've developed this IEP, we've used all this information, we've as a team come together, and let's ask the question, do we believe this IEP will reasonably enable a child to make progress in light of their circumstances? I think if the answer to that is no, or the answer to that is we don't know, then I would argue your work is not finished as an IEP team, right? So again, the standard is not an IEP that is just technically compliant. The standard is an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of their circumstances. So I would argue that an IEP that doesn't do that is in fact not compliant, right? So I think, again, both things are true. And then in terms of, I know equity is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but as a parent, I mean, I don't think anybody's in a better position than you to advocate for expanding options and opportunities for your child. That can look 1,000 different ways. And those that are closest to the student and the teams working with the students know that best. But really advocating for expanding options and opportunities for students. If equity means anything, I think it means that our job is to improve outcomes for students with disabilities and ensure that they have what they need when they need it. So out of everything that equity might mean and the various ways we might describe it, I think at the very least it means students get what they need when they need it, and that they're individuals. So then if that's true, and I believe it is, then limiting options for students is counterproductive to the goals that we have, and it's counterproductive to the nature of individualized decision making that is at the heart of the work that we do, right? So I would encourage that. And you talked a little bit about achievement gap. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do it. If anybody does it first and does it better than I would do it, then I don't need any credit, but let's talk about how we leverage it for our state. We talk a lot about achievement gap, but then I think we have to back that up. And we have, we've talked a lot more in recent years about opportunity gap. Part of why we have an achievement gap might be because we have an opportunity gap, where we really need to increase options and opportunities for students, give them these opportunities and the supports that they need to do it. That's kind of 2 steps, achievement gap, opportunity gap. I back it up a step further. Could some of this achievement gap and opportunity gap be fueled by the fact that we have an expectations gap? That maybe we really, if we're being honest, maybe we don't think our child, or we don't think this student, or maybe as a student, I don't think myself I can go to college. I don't think myself that I can contribute to the workforce in Kentucky and have a competitive integrated employment position. So I wonder if we need to talk about all of those things, achievement gap, opportunity gap, But maybe we need to do some thinking about, I wonder if we've got an achievement, an expectations gap. And I think we all know in some cases we probably do. So how do we get to that point where, wait a minute, high expectations are non-negotiable. They are individually experienced, but they are non-negotiable. And I think both things are true. Don't just say one, and certainly don't just say one and attribute it to me, please. But high expectations are non-negotiable. They are individually experienced, but high expectations are non-negotiable. So, that's my encouragement. I know sort of in the waning moments that we have. And so we've got to work. I would argue that as a group of people who all of us have a stake in the success of students with disabilities, we have to work differently. I believe we have to work more collaboratively. I think we have to work more strategically. And I think these data reveal we have to work more urgently on behalf of students in Kentucky.
I love that, Johnny. I mean, it totally sums up everything we were trying to discuss today. And I think that is so important. And that's something that we can leave families with today, that is, our expectations should always be high. And one of the things that we always did with my son Clayton is when he turned 16, just like all our other kids, it was no different. It was, you turn 16, you're going to get a job. And we always instilled that in him early on. And it wasn't, well, Clayton can have a job because he has a disability. No, it was, you're going to get a job. And so he has been employed at the same place for 7 years. And it was something that we instilled in him in an expectation level that we had early on. And so I think as the families that I talk to, a lot of times I think that is a big concern as well. I don't think they can, or they really don't want to, or I really don't want them to. And so I love the way that you phrased all of that, and I think that is going to resonate with some of the folks that either are listening to it now or hear it later. That is something that we have to think about too, as our kids are getting older. So anyway, that was a great way to put it. And as we leave, one more thing, I know that you do have some things that you're working on with the Kentucky Works through HDI, and I know you all have got some webinars coming up too. I will let everyone know in the handouts that you'll receive at the end, you will get a link to your all's how to register for those webinars that you have coming up. But can you talk just a little bit as we close here about Kentucky Works, just a little bit, and then maybe something about the webinars?
Yeah, well, Kentucky Works is a project at HDI, and we work closely with a number of partners across the state. And we got some federal money and a partnerships and improvement systems change grant back in 2016. So Kentucky Works is a project that's sort of winding down at the end of 5 years. But what we've learned from Kentucky Works and the good practices and all those other things will continue on, and also very connected with the Community Work Transition Program that many of you are probably familiar with, that is active in about 100 Kentucky school districts today. So the focus of it has been on what we've talked about really today, supporting schools and districts, parents and families as they support students with significant disabilities in obtaining competitive integrated employment. So we will highlight that in January, February, and March. We've got a 4-part webinar series. The first one is January 20th. I encourage you to register for all of them if you think it's of interest to you. But also, Kentucky is an employment first state, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today, but I'm happy to come talk about another time if you like. But by order of the governor, competitive integrated employment is the first and primary option for individuals with disabilities of working age who desire to become employed. That is the policy of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, per order of the governor. So this webinar series is focused on delivering on the promise of employment first for students with significant disabilities. So the first webinar will be a really I almost say groundbreaking. Hopefully it will be groundbreaking, but we'll be laying the groundwork for webinars 2, 3, and 4. In webinar 2, we're going to focus on student engagement and tools and processes that really help to engage students in this. And then webinar 3, we're focused on family engagement. Again, concrete tools and processes. Webinar 4 will focus on employer engagement with concrete tools and processes. So we are really hopeful this will be a value add to the work that's going on across our state.
That's awesome. And we do have Katie Whaley that's going to be with us on February the 11th talking about Employment First. So we will be.
Nobody better than Katie. Go for it.
That's right. That's right. We will be discussing that. And thank you all. Thank you, Johnny, so much for being with us today. And this is a little different format than we normally do our webinars, but I like it. I think we need to throw this in every now and then, have those real conversations. I think they're meaningful and timely. But folks, as you all hop off today, you will be prompted to complete an evaluation. If you would do that, it kind of lets us know if you like this format and maybe give us some ideas of some things that you would like for us to discuss in the future. But thank you so much, Johnny. I appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Bye.